So my research is on race, ethnicity, and immigration in France. I recently published my first book entitled Citizen Outsider, Children of North African Immigrants in France, which is based on an ethnography of children of North African immigrants, the middle class segment of this population, and how they navigate issues of cultural citizenship, marginalization, upward mobility, and race and racism. So in this book, I basically lay to rest the notion of a French exceptionalism as it relates to racial and ethnic difference, and just distinctions more generally among its population. So France is a really interesting place to think about these issues because it just allows any sort of identity category or categorization. So for example, the census doesn't measure race or ethnic origin. The idea is that individuals are supposed to relate to the state or be part of the French national community as individuals versus as members of any kind of identity category or group. But what I really show in my research is how this population, children of North African or Maghreban immigrants, are still racialized and seen as non-white, and therefore seen as inferior to white people, and in the ways in which whiteness is often seen as synonymous with Frenchness or being French. So even though my respondents, the folks that I've worked with, were born in France, they've spent their whole lives in France, and many of them see themselves as French as any other French person, they often feel like they're not treated that way. And what happens is that because France is governed by this sort of Republican ideology, there isn't a language to talk about their marginalization. It becomes really complicated when everyone's supposed to just be seen as French. So for example, my respondents who are French often are believed that they're French by other French people. So for example, people will ask them questions such as, where do you come from? And when they say, whatever town or region in France where they grew up, the follow-up question is often, well, where are you really from? Because the idea here is that what someone's trying to get at in those interactions is that they can't possibly be French, right? They must be a foreigner, they must be an immigrant, they must be from somewhere else. And so this becomes very taxing and really has quite a toll on the second generation population, who themselves feel like they've done everything quote unquote right, but still are unable to actually be fully accepted. And so I argue that the reason why they're not able to be fully accepted is because they're non-white. And France is still sort of governed by this idea that what it means to be part of French society, French culture, French values, etc., is inherently based on this idea of whiteness and white supremacy. So we can see this also when we think about the question of Muslims in France. So especially in recent years, due to several terrorist attacks in France, there's a heightened sort of Islamophobia directed to not just Muslims, but actually anyone who appears to be Muslim. So what do I mean by that? So I think it's important to recognize that France has the largest concentration of Muslims in Western Europe. But there's a lot of variation in what being Muslim in France means. For some people, it's a very crucial part or significant part of their identities. Other people maybe see themselves more as cultural Muslims and don't immediately or at least initially define themselves in that way. But what happens is France kind of has created this category of a Muslim other that's seen as dangerous, quote unquote, to French identity, French culture, etc. And so that's why you see a lot of Islamophobic sentiment that's only heightened in recent years as the state has become more and more concerned with issues of terrorism, quote unquote radical Islam, and these other sorts of things. It therefore becomes more legitimate to marginalize people who are seen as Muslim. And again, that's a way to talk about difference without explicitly talking about racial and ethnic difference. even though I'd argue that this Muslim category, this Muslim other category rather, is really a sort of acceptable category of difference for everyone who's seen as non-French, even if they are French and just as French as anyone else. So what this essentially means is that I think France is at an interesting place, a crossroads, if you will, between sort of how far they're going to stay committed to just completely allowing the multicultural nature of its society, which has existed for several decades. France actually has a very long history of immigration. How much longer is France going to cling to these ideas of all French people looking the same, having a particular kind of values, et cetera, and not acknowledge, for example, descendants of France's very brutal colonial empire in not just North Africa, the descendants of which I study, but also other parts of Africa and around the world. So, France sort of just doesn't want to talk about its colonial history, and doesn't want to acknowledge or readily acknowledge the role that it plays in how we understand both the boundaries of French society and the sort of population, the demographics of French society. So I think those are challenging issues, not just for France, but for Europe as a whole. Thank you.